All right. Hey guys, Mr. Kyle, Myers Mathematics, and let's just jump into it. This is a worksheet on using statistical models, part of Kuta software, Infinite Algebra 1. The oyster population of the Chesapeake Bay has been in decline for over 100 years. This can be expressed by the equation y is equal to 41.6 times 0.969 to the x power, where x is the number of years since 1900, just a while ago, as of the time of this video, and y is the amount of oysters harvested in metric tons. Yum. What does the y-intercept of this function represent? Okay, so this question doesn't take too long to answer, but I want to caution you on something here. When you're doing a word problem, if you don't try to interpret the problem, that's usually good. You only need to do things with the numbers and look for the answer sometimes in either the chart or in the text. So if you interpret only a little bit of the problem and try to figure out what's going on, but only a little bit, that's kind of dangerous. That's where you tend to make the most mistakes. If you interpret it a lot and really think about it, then you could understand enough of the context to validate your answer and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't just think about it a little bit and then try to be like, oh, I got it figured out, I guess. Because that's the danger zone. So you either don't really think about the context of the problem at all, which is kind of hard for some people to do because you're reading it, you're like, oh, oysters, what do oysters look like? And now you're like Google searching oysters. Like you don't need to do that in order to answer the question. If you really want to look into it because you have the extra time on a homework or whatever and you're just curious about it, that's one thing. But I wouldn't do that on a test or quiz, especially because you're limited on time, or any kind of assessment where you're timed, like the SAT or ACT or whatever. I would just look for where the answer is. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do here. What does the y-intercept of the function represent? Well, that would be 0, comma, and then it looks like it's a little bit more than 40, which is going to be this number. Well, that's when t is 0. Well, or x in this case. So x is the number of years since 1900. So if x is equal to 0, then that means we're in the year 1900. Okay? So in the year 1900, the y-intercept would represent 0, 41.6. So in the year 1900, so in 1900 AD, Anno Domini, what does the y value mean? Well, you might think that's the amount of oysters, but if you look really carefully here, it's not just the amount of oysters. It's kind of related to the amount of oysters, but it says specifically here that y is the amount of oysters that are harvested in metric tons. Now, they don't really do a good job at matching that with the graph, so you could probably answer it either way and get the answer right. Because in the text, it says y is the amount of oysters harvested in metric tons, but in the graph, it says oysters in metric tons. So you could actually say in one or two ways. You could either say, according to the text, that in 1900 AD, there are 41.6 metric tons of oysters. How do you spell oysters? O-Y. I was going to use O-U. O-Y-S-T-E-R-S. There are 41.6 metric tons of oysters harvested. Okay, so that would be probably the best way to answer it, I think, because I think maybe the graph is kind of like trying to shorten it, but in shortening it, they're kind of saying something different. So you could, according to the graph, you could say in 1900 AD, there are 41.6 metric tons of oysters. So notice that's almost exactly the same thing, but I add the word harvested on there. So it seems like that's probably what they're looking for, is that it's the amount of oysters that are harvested, not the ones that exist in the ocean or whatever. This is again that context where it's like, okay, like are we reading too much into this here? If you only read into it a little bit, it's like, wait a second, is that the same thing? Those seem like totally different things. But if you think about it even more, it's like, okay, well, if you're talking about fishermen or whatever, and they're harvesting, or they're going to be able to harvest less oysters if there are less oysters. So even though those numbers wouldn't represent the exact same thing, they're gonna be they're gonna they're gonna like run together, right? They're dependent on each other. That would be direct variation. So as as the amount of oysters harvested decreases, then that means that the population is decreasing, most likely, because there's less to harvest. And so if you're harvesting less, then there's less to harvest. Not that, they all of a sudden got a good conscious in conservation of oysters, or there's so many other things in the background of this problem, right? Like, is it a bad thing that we're harvesting too many? Are we affecting the ecosystem in a negative way? But then on the other hand, it's like, well, maybe we should, have some sort of program where we can, put more oysters back in there, but we do need to harvest them because they do taste yummy to some people. I don't particularly like them, but I don't dislike them. I don't know, kind of in the middle on the taste of oysters. But there's so many things to think about with this problem, but you don't need to think about all those things to answer the problem. You can see the answer in the text. If you think about it really, really in depth, then you can start to make sense out of what they're saying in the problem. But if you don't think about it in depth enough, danger zone. So long, a long explanation to a short question, but that's where we'll land for today. So hopefully this video has been helpful. I almost said this helpful has been helpful. Hopefully this video has been helpful, and we'll have more of these to come if you're watching this around the time that I'm putting this out, putting them out one at a time here. So stay tuned for the rest of this worksheet, and I'll catch you in the next video real soon.